Evidence to action. What are the challenges with disability data in Australia? Australia has a lot of disability data, but that doesn't mean we have a clear picture. This video is going to cover definitions, fragmentation, gaps and barriers to using data. Definitions. The first challenge is definitions. You might think disability data starts with a simple question. Who counts as a person with disability? But the reality is much more complicated. Disability is not defined in the same way across datasets. In some places, people are asked to self-identify, to say whether they experience disability themselves. In other systems, disability is recognised through a diagnosis, impairment, or functional difficulty. And in many administrative systems, disability only becomes visible if someone is eligible for support or services. So sometimes a person is visible in the data, and sometimes in another system they are not. The same person who might appear in one dataset disappear in another and be counted differently again somewhere else. Definitions in the law. And definitions do not just vary across datasets, they also vary across laws, frameworks and systems. For example, the Disability Discrimination Act, or DDA, has a broad legal definition focused on protection from discrimination. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD, takes a rights-based approach. It recognises disability as something shaped by the interaction between a person and barriers in society. And the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, often called the ICF, looks at disability through health, functioning, participation and environment. None of these definitions are necessarily wrong, but they are created for different purposes. One focuses on rights, one on legal protection, one on health and functioning. So when we look at disability data, one of the first questions to ask is, what definition of disability is being used here, and what might that definition leave in or leave out? Flags, tags, and indicators. Another thing you will often hear in disability data is the language of flags, tags, and indicators. And while they can sound technical, the ideas are actually quite practical. A flag is one way of identifying disability in data. In the National Disability Data Asset, disability flags are community-supported ways of recognising disability using information that already exists across systems. A tag is a marker. It helps identify something important in the data, for example, a particular service interaction, experience, or characteristic that researchers might want to understand more deeply. And then there are indicators. Indicators help us measure change over time. They're often used to answer questions like, are outcomes improving? Who is benefiting? Where are the gaps and what needs more attention? Because the way disability is flagged, tagged, or measured influences what becomes visible and what does not. We need disability data that helps us understand not only who people are today, but also how experiences change across a lifetime. So when looking at disability data, it is always worth asking, what is being measured here and what might be missing? Who owns disability data? This question is more complicated than it sounds. Legally, disability data may sit with governments, universities, service systems, or organisations. People with disabilities share enormous amounts of information with systems, often repeatedly. Yet many people describe losing control of their story once data enters a system. Some people describe data being cherry-picked. So perhaps the question is not only who owns disability data, perhaps it is who has agency over disability data, who decides the questions, who interprets the findings, who benefits from the answers, and who is accountable if the data is incomplete, wrong, or harmful. Responsibility sits across many places. Governments collect administrative data, researchers generate evidence, services gather information, and advocacy organisations document gaps and lived experience. Fragmentation and gaps. Fragmentation remains one of the biggest challenges. Data often sits in silos, each holding part of the story, a story about a person. And when systems do not connect, people with disability are often asked to tell the same story again and again, and the burden shifts back to the individual. There are also gaps. Some people and experiences are not well represented, including certain disability types, children and young people, and people with intersecting identities. Barriers to using it. And even when disability data exists, that does not automatically mean it gets used or used well. Sometimes the barrier is access. The data may be difficult to obtain, expensive, fragmented across systems, or require specialist skills to analyse. Sometimes the barrier is interpretation. Data can be complex, incomplete, or difficult to make sense of without lived experience, context, or community knowledge. And sometimes the barrier is translation into action. Good evidence does not always find its way into policy programs or practice. We can have strong data sitting in reports, dashboards, or journal articles, but still struggle to shift systems because data on its own does not create change. People do. Change happens when evidence is understood, trusted, communicated well, combined with lived experience, and used at the right moment in decision making. So part of the challenge is not only generating better disability data, it is making sure it is accessible, meaningful, and usable for the people making decisions and for the communities whose lives are reflected in it. What good looks like. So what does good look like? The reality is that Australia already has a lot of disability data. The challenge is not always the absence of data, often the challenge is what happens after the data exists. We move from data to insights, learning something important about people's experiences, barriers, or outcomes. But then we often hit an implementation gap. We know something matters, but systems, services, or policy do not always change. And sometimes there is an accountability gap. We struggle to know who is responsible for action, did anything improve, and for whom. This is where disability research plays an important role, not only in collecting new data, but in helping connect the dots, bringing together lived experience, community knowledge, administrative data, and evidence, making sense of what the data is telling us, and importantly, helping translate evidence into decisions and change. Because good disability data is not simply more data, it is meaningful data. Data that is shaped with people with disability, grounded in clear definitions, connected across systems, accessible to communities, and ultimately used. Used to improve policy, used to improve practice, used to improve people's everyday lives. Because good disability data should not stop at insight, it should help create action.